They called him the town's sweetheart. Charming, handsome, and with a smile that could light up any room. Everyone loved him. He was the kind of guy you'd want as your best friend, your neighbor, your son-in-law. For years, he was the picture-perfect citizen, the guy everyone trusted without a second thought. But there was one teenager, a kid who didn't quite fit in with the crowd, who saw right through him. This wasn't just another small-town story of gossip and rumors. No, this teenager had uncovered a side to him that no one could have imagined, a deadly side, a side that would soon shake the very foundation of their town. It was a quiet community, one where everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. For most people, the idea of a con man in their midst was the stuff of crime thrillers and tabloid headlines. But this teenager, maybe because he was always on the outside looking in, picked up on things that others missed. Small inconsistencies in the way the man spoke, odd behaviors that seemed just a little off. It was like a puzzle he couldn't quite finish. Something felt wrong, and in a town where things didn't change much, it was easy to miss the signs. Or worse, dismiss them entirely. But this teenager wasn't the type to ignore his gut feelings. He started digging, quietly at first, not knowing how deep he was about to go. He uncovered lies, carefully spun stories that painted a picture of a man who wasn't who he said he was. It wasn't just the town sweetheart he was dealing with. No, there was something much darker lurking beneath that polished exterior. At first, it was hard to believe. How could the man everyone admired, who volunteered at the local shelter, who helped out at the school, who was the life of every party, really, be hiding a dangerous secret? The kid knew he had to be careful. This wasn't just a matter of exposing a liar. This was a matter of exposing someone capable of ruining lives, manipulating everyone around him. The closer the teenager got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. It was like pulling on a thread that slowly began to unravel everything. The good name, the friendly reputation, the trust. What would happen when the truth finally came to light? But just as the teenager started to piece things together, something happened that he hadn't anticipated. The man seemed to know that someone was onto him. The tension in the air grew thicker, and suddenly, the game wasn't just about uncovering a con. It was about survival. Every move the teenager made felt like it was being watched. He could feel the heat on his back, the dangerous game of cat and mouse that was about to become a whole lot more intense. What would happen when the man found out the teenager was onto him? Would the town sweetheart go to any lengths to keep his deadly secret buried? Or would the truth finally come out, no matter the cost? The story's far from over, but trust me, the next part will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the people around you. Stay tuned. The teenager, Jake, wasn't like the others in town. He was quieter, more observant, always keeping to himself, while the other kids his age were caught up in the usual small-town drama. Jake preferred to stay on the edges, observing life rather than participating in it. He'd grown up here, seen the same faces for years, and in his young mind, he thought he knew everyone. But that all changed the day he started noticing things about Peter Matthews, the so-called town sweetheart. Peter had lived in the town for almost a decade. He was the kind of person who seemed to be everywhere, helping with fundraisers, organizing town events, volunteering at the local high school. If you asked anyone, they'd tell you he was the heart and soul of the community. He had a way of making everyone feel important, like they were his best friend, his closest confidant. He made people feel seen, which in a small town like theirs was rare. But Jake wasn't fooled by the charm. There was something about the way Peter always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, as if he were trying too hard to be perfect. Jake started paying closer attention, and soon enough, things started to feel off. Peter's past was always a bit murky. No one seemed to know where he'd come from before moving to town, and his background was a mystery. People didn't ask questions, though. No one in the town cared to dig deeper. But Jake did. He had an instinct for spotting people who weren't what they seemed. And Peter Matthews was no exception. It wasn't long before Jake started hearing whispers, little things that didn't add up. There was talk of Peter being involved in a few shady deals here and there, all of it vague enough that it could have been dismissed as rumors. But Jake wasn't one to let things slide, and he began to quietly piece together the fragments of information. What he uncovered left him shocked, yet oddly determined. Peter wasn't just a smooth-talking philanthropist. He had a dark side, and it wasn't just about lying. It was about manipulation, about preying on the town's trust to cover up his real intentions. The deeper Jake dug, the more unsettling the discovery became. It turned out Peter wasn't just a con man. He had a history of financial scams, of taking advantage of people who trusted him. He'd stolen from businesses, swindled elderly people out of their savings, and left behind a trail of broken lives. But he always managed to stay one step ahead. His charm, his ability to blend in with the community, allowed him to stay under the radar for years. People didn't question him. They admired him. They believed he was the kind of person who made a difference, who was making their town a better place. As Jake continued his investigation, the tension in the air grew. Every time he uncovered a new lie, every time he found another victim of Peter's deception, the stakes got higher. He knew that he had to act, but the fear of being caught was suffocating. Peter had eyes everywhere, and Jake was beginning to realize that exposing Peter wasn't just going to ruin his reputation, it could put him in real danger. One night, after weeks of careful surveillance, Jake finally found something that made his blood run cold. Peter had a secret safe hidden in his house. It wasn't just a place for documents or valuables. No, Jake quickly realized that this safe was where Peter kept his most incriminating evidence. The names of people he'd tricked, the dirty deals he'd made, the entire web of lies he'd spun. The safe was the key to everything. If Jake could get inside, he could expose Peter once and for all. But he wasn't the only one who knew about it. Jake's every move seemed to be under the watchful eye of someone or something. The days that followed were a blur of nerves and close calls. Jake tried to stay out of sight, but Peter was onto him. There was no way he couldn't have known by now that someone had been snooping around. The smile, the friendly gestures, those were all just a mask. The real Peter, the con man, was finally starting to show through. Every conversation Jake had with him felt like a subtle warning, like Peter was daring him to continue down this dangerous path. But Jake couldn't back out now. He had to know the truth. And so, one cold, rainy night, when Peter was out at a meeting in the town hall, Jake made his move. He slipped into Peter's house, careful not to make a sound. The house was dark, quiet, eerily so. As Jake crept toward the study, he felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was his chance. He knew that this was the moment that could change everything. He found the safe easily enough, hidden in a back room behind a portrait. His hands trembled as he worked to unlock it. The numbers seemed to blur together, but somehow the lock clicked. Open! Inside, the papers were stacked neatly, each one more damning than the last. Jake's eyes scanned the documents, the bank statements, the names of victims, the scheming, the lies. The evidence was undeniable. Peter Matthews was a fraud, and Jake had all the proof he needed. But just as Jake was about to take the papers, a noise came from the hallway, a creak of the floorboards. Jake froze. His heart skipped a beat. Someone was coming. The seconds felt like hours as he rushed to shove the papers back in the safe and quickly lock it. But it was too late. The door to the study creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Peter. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even surprised. It was cold, calculating. He had been waiting for this moment. "Well, Jake," Peter said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "I've been wondering when you'd finally figure it out." Jake's pulse raced, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. He had been caught, and now he had to face the man who had been deceiving an entire town. The real question was, what would Peter do next? Jake stood frozen, the blood draining from his face as Peter's words hung in the air. Peter didn't look angry, not in the way Jake had expected. Instead, there was an eerie calm in his eyes, like he was merely humoring Jake. It was almost as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time, waiting for Jake to finally catch on. But Jake couldn't back down now. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline. But he forced himself to stand tall. "You've been on to me for a while, haven't you?" Peter said, stepping further into the room. His smile was the same one everyone in town adored. Smooth, charismatic, untrustworthy. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for." Jake's mind was racing, his thoughts a whirlwind. Peter wasn't here to stop him from exposing him. No, Peter had something else in mind. This wasn't the first time he'd been caught. Peter had gotten this far because of his ability to manipulate, to turn things around in his favor. He wasn't going to let a teenager get in his way. Not when he had everything under control. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but Peter beat him to it. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you've caught me, that you've got all the evidence you need to take me down. But here's the thing, Jake," Peter said, taking a step closer. "You're just a kid. You can't handle what comes next. Do you really think anyone would believe you over me?" The words stung, and Jake felt a wave of doubt creeping in. He had uncovered the truth, but Peter was right about one thing. He was just a teenager. People would see him as the troublemaker, the one who had stirred up the town's peaceful facade. Could he really convince everyone that Peter, the town's sweetheart, was a con man? The odds were stacked against him. Peter's eyes glinted, like he could see right through Jake's hesitation. "I admire your persistence," Peter continued, almost conversationally. "But you don't understand the game. I'm not some small-time scam artist. I've built my life here. People trust me. They'd never believe you over me." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But here's the catch, Jake. You're already in too deep." Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. Peter wasn't just trying to intimidate him. He was making a move, one that could change everything. Jake realized with a cold sense of dread that Peter wasn't just threatening him. He was preparing for the inevitable fallout. The stakes had just been raised, and the cost of exposing Peter was much higher than Jake had ever imagined. "I can make this go away," Peter said, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "I can make you disappear. All you have to do is walk away, forget everything, and go back to being just another kid in this town. Otherwise, well, let's just say your future could be very short." Jake's mind raced. There it was, the ultimatum. Walk away, and the secret would stay buried. But could he live with that? Could he let Peter continue to ruin lives just to protect his own? No, Jake had already come too far. He had seen too much. He looked Peter straight in the eyes and said the one thing he had been too afraid to say before. "I won't let you get away with it." For a moment, there was silence. Peter's smile faltered, just for a second, and in that instant, Jake knew he had made the right decision. He wasn't alone. He wasn't just some kid. He had people who believed in him, people who trusted him, and he wasn't going to let them down. Peter's expression twisted. You think you can take me down. You think you've got what it takes. His voice was sharp now, the mask cracking. But Jake stood firm. No, Jake replied. But I don't have to do it alone. Just then, the door to the study burst open. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway were several of the town's key figures. People who had been in on the secret for longer than Jake knew. They were the ones who had quietly suspected Peter's lies, but had been too afraid to act. Until now. We're not going to let him get away with it, Jake, said Mr. Thompson, the local sheriff. We've been watching him for years. You're not alone in this. Peter's face turned pale, his confident mask slipping completely as he realized the jig was up. The sheriff had been gathering evidence for months, quietly working behind the scenes. The people who had once been blind to Peter's manipulation were now stepping forward to take action. The truth was finally coming to light. Within hours, Peter Matthews was arrested. The small-town sweetheart, the charming, untouchable figure, was exposed for what he truly was, a ruthless con man who had been taking advantage of the community for far too long. The evidence was irrefutable, and with the help of the townspeople who had come together, justice was served. Jake's role in it all didn't go unnoticed. Despite being young, he had stood up when everyone else had turned a blind eye. He had been the one to connect the dots, to push forward when it seemed easier to walk away. In the end, Jake wasn't just the kid who had uncovered a criminal. He was the one who reminded the town that sometimes, even the quietest voices can make the loudest impact. As the dust settled and life slowly returned to normal, Jake realized something. The real victory wasn't just in exposing Peter. It was in the way the town had come together, in the way they had chosen truth over deception. People now understood the power of trust and the danger of blind admiration. And while Peter was behind bars, Jake knew that the town would never be the same. The truth had changed everything, but it had also made them stronger.